Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another interview here on Purple Chorus. Now, today's guest is a retired neurologist and author, as well as a parent of a child with epilepsy. And in one of his fantastic books, which was Sacred Lives, he actually brings those two worlds together and offers perspective as a neurologist and as a father as well. I've met my guest a few times over the last few years, and I'm absolutely delighted to have him as my guest today. So, a big hello to Dr. Ian Bone.
Thank you, Guy, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure. So, as I mentioned, probably, certainly, to me, your brilliant book is Sacred Lives. Um, but I just want to touch on initially your work as a neurologist and how you have seen the trajectory of the understanding and treatment of epilepsy over your career.
Okay. My career goes back a long, long time. It goes back to 1978 when I first became a neurologist. I was one of five neurologists in Glasgow, and we had a population of just about 2.5 million. So there were only five of us to see all of these conditions, and we saw every condition. There was no specialization. There was no epileptologist. We all saw all of the neurology. So you could say in those days our skills were rather diluted. We had to be a jack of all trades and
Yes.
basically a master of none. We knew a little about a lot, but not a lot about a little. And that, I suppose, is how things have changed because now in Glasgow, I think there are five consultant neurologists who specialize in epilepsy alone.
Wow.
That's exactly the same number that were in 1978 when I started that did everything. So
Wow.
clearly everything has changed enormously.
Mhm.
Whether it's changed for the good or not, it is something that I'm sure we'll cover as we go on.
Yes. And what persuaded you or pointed you in the direction uh, of looking more closely at epilepsy?
I think because of epilepsy being in my family, my son developed his first seizures below the age of 5,
Right.
and now in his 50s still has active epilepsy.
Mm.
He went through a period in his early teens where he was seizure free, and we thought it had gone away.
Hmm.
And it didn't. So living, in tandem with seeing people with the same condition that you're going home to in the evening,
Hmm.
it is an odd situation to be in, but it's not a unique situation,
No.
given how frequent epilepsy is. And given the numbers of neurologists now in the United Kingdom, there must be nearly 1,000 now. There must be at least 10 parents amongst that group who also have a child with epilepsy. And
Mhm.
of those 10, there'll be three who have a child with epilepsy who's still having active seizures.
Right. Interesting. And of course, our mutual friend, Dr. Julie Thompson-Dobkin, is also a parent of a child with epilepsy as well. Um,
She is. And again, just to mention her wonderful organization, the Hidden Truths Project,
it is
which does its
brilliant.
best to promote the image of epilepsy through art and creativity. And Julie has done magnificent work there
She
and
has.
is to be absolutely commended on everything that she's done. Again, bringing that out of a personal experience and
Yes.
then realizing from that personal experience that you can give something back.
Mhm.
Maybe what you have is not ideal and maybe what you have is difficult to manage, but that doesn't stop you from being able to perhaps give something back to the epilepsy community. And
Yes.
it helps you therapeutically to do that as well.
It does, and I mean, I can very much vouch for that fact. Being a composer with epilepsy, I do feel as though I am giving something to the epilepsy community that perhaps they otherwise wouldn't. be able to access,
Mhm.
uh, which is the knowledge and the experience which is in here, you know. Uh,
I think so often people within the epilepsy community, their knowledge and their skills aren't necessarily tapped upon by certain organizations that represent epilepsy. Particularly, I think, and it's maybe unfair to make such a generalization, but I sometimes think within the charity world that
yes,
the skills of people, the desire for people who are walking the walk to make a
yes,
contribution is
yes.
often kind of impeded by the kind of, are you qualified to talk about this? Well, of
Mhm.
course you're qualified if you have the condition. You may
Yes.
not have a health qualification, but
Mhm.
you can speak and you can contribute and you can help.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. I had a similar conversation with David Stafford, who runs the site Brain Ablaze, uh,
Yes,
recently, and he said in the US that he finds that quite often epilepsy charities or epilepsy organizations are very corporate based uh, rather than necessarily epilepsy based.
mm,
And the emphasis for entry is how much money have you got?
mm.
You know?
I think also there's an emphasis on telling a good story, a happy story. And
Yes.
again, when you go to so many of the websites and you see champions of epilepsy being promoted by epilepsy societies and charities,
Mhm.
these tend to be the people who've had good outcomes, been successful, are seen as a role model. And I
Mhm.
think they don't necessarily touch upon those who've had less happy outcomes and
This is
remain
very
with
true.
trouble with seizures and trouble with employment and trouble with relationships and everything. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there definitely is a flip side to sharing success stories, because whilst it might give hope, it might also put a magnifying glass to some people's own less successful experiences.
Yes.
And it
Yes.
might make them think, well, why can't I achieve those things? Why haven't I had those successes? You know,
Yes.
is
Yes.
it something I've done? Uh, you know, what's in it for me? You
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
uh,
Yes.
etc. Which does, of course, make some people shy away from reading success stories
Yes. Yes.
because it
Absolutely.
makes them feel at times, some people, not everybody, but makes them feel less successful.
I
Uh,
know it's this kind of dichotomy between you can be successful with epilepsy and you can rise and rise and rise, but you don't want to throw that in the face of somebody who has been less successful, who then may
100%.
feel that they have failed. Yes, yes,
Yes, absolutely. So in Sacred Lives, you talk about the history of epilepsy, which, of course, as we know, goes back thousands of years.
yes,
I mean,
yes, yes.
there are a lot of people who believe that epilepsy is quite a new thing,
Hmm.
and don't realize just how far back it goes. Um, in fact, to quote one of the things that you've mentioned and I've heard mentioned before is the history of epilepsy can be summarized as 4,000 years of ignorance, superstition, and stigma, followed by 100 years of knowledge, superstition, and stigma.
Yes,
And how incredibly true that is.
yes, yes.
Would you like to kind of elaborate on that quote a bit?
Yes, certainly. Well, I mean, epilepsy goes back to Hippocrates, the father of medicine, if you like, was one of the first people to describe it and even suggested avoiding stress and um, trying to live a quiet, relaxed life to prevent seizures from occurring. So he had some lifestyle advice all those years ago.
Mhm.
We went through a period where epilepsy in Greek and Roman times was regarded by some as a sacred disease. And
Yes.
that's the reason for the title of the book, Sacred Lives.
Right.
People with epilepsy were felt to actually be blessed or to have insight or to have understanding of the world that others didn't.
Hmm.
We then went into the kind of Middle Ages, when in the Middle Ages, epilepsy was attached to wizards and witches and evil people. And
Hmm.
there was belief that if you came into contact with someone with epilepsy, they could spread the germs onto you, so you spat when you saw them.
Wow.
Um, there are all sorts of things that got enshrined in history that stigmatized over hundreds and hundreds of years the condition. And
Mhm.
I suppose the thing that stigmatizes it more than anything is that as we move gradually into a world where epilepsy becomes more visible, and we're talking here about the kind of 19th and 20th century, when it
Mm.
becomes more visible, society wants to put epilepsy away somewhere. And
Yes.
initially it was in the poorhouses, it was in the prisons, the almshouses.
Yeah.
Um, People in the Victorian times from a middle class family would not admit to epilepsy. They would conceal it because they
Yes.
knew the stigma that it carried with it.
Which
Even
sadly to this day it still does.
it still does. And I suppose there's such a backlog of this kind of misinformation and mythology that
Mhm.
it's a mountain that is so steep to climb. And
Mm.
every time we think we're climbing it and we're making progress, we slip back because a story appears in a newspaper about someone with epilepsy who's done this or done that,
Mhm.
and it just stigmatizes all over again.
Yeah.
You may get in the story someone with epilepsy has murdered somebody,
Yeah.
but you won't get a news story saying someone with asthma has murdered somebody. That's
No.
because epilepsy carries so much of an emotive disapproval that other
Yes.
medical conditions don't.
It
And
does.
our problem is how we resolve that. And recently there was a paper reviewing a systematic review looking at all the papers that have been written in the literature on stigma, and
Wow.
they ran into the hundreds.
I can well imagine.
And run into the hundreds, and the net result of these hundreds of papers in terms of improving the lot of people with epilepsy wasn't very tangible.
No, I mean, I was in Lisbon at the ILA and IBE Congress a month ago, and I went to the session on social issues. Um, and afterwards, because the topic of one of the talks was self-stigma,
Mhm.
uh, which of course is fed by external stigma.
Yes, yeah.
Um, and because if there's sufficient external stigma, then you start to believe it and stigmatize yourself,
Mhm.
uh, which is an even bigger, a harder circle to try and get out of. But what I said to the presenter afterwards, I said, I very much enjoyed your talk. I said it was very good, very informative. I said, however, to kind of play a slightly devil's advocate, if you like, I said, when I started attending congresses and conferences 15 years ago, I was more or less hearing exactly the same thing as I've heard today. And I said, and there's a very strong likelihood that in 15 years' time, I could come back and hear somebody else saying exactly the same thing as you are today.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely
Um,
correct.
and I
Yeah.
said the other kind of downfall, obviously congresses and conferences are great events, and it's wonderful to get experts in the field together from all over the world, etc., who've got different perspectives and breakthroughs. But the great big gap is the lack of attendance from people who essentially are the ones who need to know, which is the people who aren't already in the epilepsy community.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Because the danger is that these conferences and congresses are simply speaking to the converted.
I think that that's absolutely correct. And I think one of the problems, and you've seen this where people, I mean, there have been publications on people running courses in a factory to tell people about epilepsy and then revisiting that factory several years later and
Mhm.
finding out that actually things improved for a week or two after the course, but then things slip back. And I suppose the great difficulty is getting people interested in a subject where they have no experience of it, no
That's
family
exactly
member
it.
with it.
Yeah.
And you think, well, why should I sit down and have a talk about epilepsy? I think a good example of that, this is in education.
Hmm.
Because a few years ago, teachers, when they went to teacher training college,
Hmm.
were taught about conditions like epilepsy and autism. My
Right.
understanding is that if that happens today, it's very minimal. And
Right.
most teachers in the classroom will only learn about epilepsy if they have a pupil, and they
Hmm.
will go home and they will sort of responsibly read about it so they know how to
Yes.
handle an emergency situation.
Yes.
But they're not being taught this necessarily in the colleges and the courses that train them as teachers.
No, I mean, my wife is a teacher, and she mentioned to me a few weeks back that this year she actually does have a pupil who has epilepsy. And she actually said to the school, she said, well, she said, I am aware of how to handle these situations and through experience. Um, but it is extremely true that I actually, one of the people that I met in Lisbon actually wrote a children's book on epilepsy uh, for primary school children uh, in the hope of actually normalizing the condition at a
Yes.
very early stage. And I was talking to one of my previous guests, Teresa Lentner, last night actually, and we were saying that when it comes to stigma, which of course is a big part of and as big a part as lack of education, if something, it largely comes down to environmental history and exposure. So, for example, if you grow up in a house where somebody in that household is an amputee or is in a wheelchair or has epilepsy, then that becomes the norm much faster than if your first exposure to amputation or wheelchair or epilepsy is later on in
Yes.
life.
Yes. Yes.
And and because the brain, a lot of people have described the brain as being like a sponge. If you expose the sponge to those scenarios at an earlier stage, then it becomes less of an issue than it is later on.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
And in that particular conversation, we were talking about non-binary identity and the place of non-binary identity in education. Um, and I'll give you an example. My niece recently left school, and she said that there was a pupil in her class who identified as a table.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And obviously, everybody will have different perspectives on that and views, etc. But the idea of introducing the concept of something at an early stage does make it more manageable than if it's, say, introduced in high school or something like that.
Mhm.
And when we get onto the subject of ableism, uh, then that is very much the case.
Mhm.
That society often brings up these hurdles and these barriers because those people have not been exposed to the world of disability or specifically epilepsy before.
think that's absolutely correct. I mean, there is evidence that children are more understanding of disability and more accepting of disability than adults.
Yeah,
If there is somebody in their class, they are more understanding, and there's evidence supporting that. I agree. The younger that you get people to understand about all the things in the world, and disability is one of them, the better. And that's a case if you're trying to reduce stigma of targeting, looking to see where you need to teach and where you need to promote. And the
hmm,
other areas you need to teach and promote are the professionals that handle people with epilepsy.
yeah,
For instance, in social work,
yes,
um, very few social workers I've come across dealing with someone with epilepsy have a knowledge of the condition unless they responsibly go away and learn about it in their own time, which a lot of them will.
yeah,
The police the police handle people having seizures on the street, but what training is there for the police? Very little.
very,
I know
very.
Epilepsy Scotland a few years ago did start a program and put together a video, and I
Mhm.
think a couple of videos I've seen from the States of police forces where they do epilepsy awareness and epilepsy training for patrolmen. But again, this is all piecemeal. It's not part of any kind of proper structured program of educating the people who come into contact with epilepsy. And that's where you need to target to try and reduce stigma. That's
Yeah,
one of
it's
the
it's
areas you need to target.
firefighting versus fire prevention. Yeah,
Absolutely. There's a
yeah.
very good expression, and to get back to stigma and parenting, one of the most difficult things as a parent is not to become what's called a stigma coach. That you, because your child hasn't been invited to the party that all the other children in the class have been invited to, you begin to feel that this is due to the epilepsy.
Hmm,
And you transfer that idea subconsciously to your child. And
hmm,
therefore, you are becoming the child's stigma coach. And
hmm.
you're teaching the child to self-stigmatize.
Yes.
And that is such a difficult thing to avoid. And there's a wonderful expression that a lot of people use, and that is that if you have a condition, whether it's epilepsy, autism, whatever, you don't prepare the child for the road ahead. You prepare the road ahead for the child.
That is a brilliant phrase. I absolutely love that phrase. Uh, is that your own quote or is it
I don't know. There's a famous thing between, I think it was Whistler and Oscar Wilde, where Whistler said something and Oscar Wilde said, I wish I'd said that. And Whistler said, You will, Oscar, you will.
all right? Another Oscar Wilde quote I came across this morning was actually life often imitates art more than art imitates life.
Yes, yes,
Um, and it is so very true.
yes,
Um,
yes, yeah, yeah.
and I read a article by Dr. Stefan, is it Eva or Eva, um, recently about the representation of epilepsy in opera,
Yes,
um,
yes, yes, yes,
which of course is also a subject well understood by Michael Trimble as well.
yes,
My
yes,
son.
yes, yes.
Um, and Dr. Evers said he only came across four examples. And he said in all four examples, which included the opera version of Othello,
Mm,
um, the representation of epilepsy was more emblematic than realistic. Um, and
yes,
he said
yes.
that was true from a musical perspective as well. He said in lots of cases the moment of the seizure was represented by the descending chromatic scale,
Mm,
to give the effect of falling and
mm,
losing control and such like. Um, and he said one of the problems you have there, one of the dichotomies you have there is if people go to see that opera, then yes, they've seen an artistic representation of epilepsy, However, because of the artistic representation, it doesn't actually give them a representation of how broad and diverse epilepsy actually is.
Yes, yes.
It gives them one fragment. It's like giving somebody one pixel of an entire picture,
Mhm.
you know?
Absolutely. I think you broached this with your earlier interview with Sean Kenny when you
Yes.
were mentioning the depiction of seizures in theatre, on stage and on film, and it tends to be the tonic-clonic. It tends to be the major seizure, the
Mhm.
one with the dramatic effect,
Yes.
and the seizures that are the complex partial, the staring attacks, the wandering attacks, the vague-looking attacks don't really find their place in any of the canon of the displaying of epilepsy in the media.
No.
So we're getting a complete false impression there of what epilepsy is. We're
Mhm.
also getting a misrepresentation in the media of a very good paper which looked at, I think, 5 American soaps.
Right.
From those 5 American soaps, Chicago Live, ER, what have you, they managed to, over goodness knows how many episodes, find about 30 seizures that had
Wow.
been part of the program. And of those 30 seizures, the first aid given by either the nurses or the actors, being the nurses and the doctors, the first aid was totally incorrect. And
No.
even on one occasion involved putting a spoon in somebody's mouth. And
Good.
that was on a soap on television. So again,
Modern day.
it's this need if you're going to have something in the media that is representing epilepsy, how you need to talk to the epilepsy community. And I
Yes.
think Sean mentioned this as well, how you need to go out and speak to people and say, am I doing this right? How
Yeah.
should I do this better? How can I use this as an educational vehicle rather than just a dramatic moment in a film?
Yeah, I mean, Doc Martin, which, of course, for those who are watching outside of the UK, was a highly successful drama series set in Cornwall. Um, and with Martin Clunes, who played a fantastic character. I read an article in which he said that every single condition that was represented in Doc Martin was actually referenced and checked and double checked and triple checked with doctors. Um, so essentially, if anybody was to be the vehicle for the lesser known epilepsies, it would probably be Martin Clunes in
Right, right.
Doc Martin because they do use doctors to
Yes.
cross-reference and triple check everything that's in there.
I think there's an example of that in EastEnders when one of the main cast in the EastEnders, the UK soap, was a girl. I think her name was Maddie. I can't remember, but she was someone with epilepsy,
Right.
and they used the took advice from the Epilepsy Society in how the seizures should be presented to make sure they were presented correctly. But they also touched upon Maddie's attempt, I think her name was Maddie, her attempt to get into the army, and the fact
Right.
that in trying to get into the army, she concealed her epilepsy.
Yes,
And that brings us on really to another topic.
it does. Yeah. Of discrimination in the workplace,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
which is very, very big. Uh, I know from a personal level, as a former cruise ship musician, um, there are a number of very big cruise ship companies um, who will simply not employ a person who has epilepsy even if their role on board doesn't involve any direct, let's say, bridge operation, you know. Um, there are different medical, pre-employment medical examinations for different cruise companies, but most of the larger ones do use what is called the PEME, and in the PEME, it states that if you have epilepsy, firstly, you have to be seizure free for 5 years, which I am. But on top of which, you have to be medication free for 5 years as well,
Yes, yes, yes.
which of course makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's really no legislation. I mean, to me, one of the examples of inconsistency is car driving. When you look across Europe, North America, you have different
Mhm.
6 months in some American states for seizure freedom.
Mhm.
UK, Europe, it's so variable. It's almost impossible to keep up with what the legislation actually is.
Yes. And of course, that largely comes down to honesty
Yes,
from
it
the
does.
patient, because the patient could quite easily say, "Oh no, I haven't had any seizures for the last 6 months or for the last year. Can I have my license back, please? Thank you very much." When
Yeah.
in fact, the opposite is true.
I don't know if you've ever had to fill in any of these forms.
I have, yes.
Yeah, and you'll know how ambiguous the questions are.
Yeah,
Like, when was the first seizure before the last nighttime seizure?
yes,
And the one you're asked always was, when was your first seizure? And
yes.
you have to keep a record of what you say because when you're filling in the form a few years later, you may have said when I was seven one year, you go
Mhm.
and say, oh, when I was eight the next year. Then there's an
Yes,
inconsistency. So
yes,
you have to be
absolutely.
looking over your shoulder the whole time with these forms and keep a record of what you've actually filled in.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that in India, um, if you have epilepsy, then you're simply not allowed to drive ever.
Hmm,
Stop.
hmm.
Um,
Well,
so,
I think it's an interesting statistic that you're more likely the accidents in relation to epilepsy and accidents in relation to people under the age of 20 driving. It's people under the age of 20 who shouldn't drive, not people with epilepsy.
mhm.
The
and
accidents far outnumber.
and I mean, I argued with the not with the cruise companies themselves, but people in that line that because my seizures have been controlled
Mm,
for more than a decade, then I'm actually less likely to have an epileptic seizure than the captain is.
yes, yes,
You know,
yes,
statistically,
yes,
because
yes,
of the spontaneity of
yes,
an
yes,
epileptic seizure,
yes.
because as we know, an epileptic seizure can happen to anyone at any time for without any precursor whatsoever.
Absolutely. Yes, yes. I mean,
Um,
there's a figure there that 1 in 25 people at some time during their life will have a seizure. Yes.
yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think the other issue with employment is that, we obviously have regulations and around this and laws around it. But if you're applying for a job, there's a real dilemma
Mhm.
because if you declare your epilepsy on the application form, you are entitled to an interview. Anyone who declares a disability is entitled to be interviewed. But by raising the flag that you have a disability, you
Mhm.
get to the interview, but then you're getting into a situation where for reasons of the workplace, we're too small a firm to make reasonable allowances. All of these things then become barriers to prevent you from getting the job. So
Mhm.
some people don't disclose.
No,
And when they don't disclose and they then have a seizure at work because they're anxious about having a seizure at work because they haven't disclosed, the whole
yes,
thing goes from bad to worse.
yes, absolutely. And in turn, that doesn't really do any favors to the rest of the epilepsy community,
No, no.
because it gives the epilepsy community a reputation of, well, look, he had a seizure at work, so I'm not going to employ somebody with epilepsy, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, but as I said to when I was giving the talk in Newcastle one day, um, that unfortunately we are still in the situation in the 21st century where telling the truth can be a very expensive business.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I mean, I am very, very fortunate that I have been able to work and earn a living. and have a roof over my head, etc., and travel and meet incredible people. But there are a huge amount of people who are not so fortunate.
No.
Um, and or there's another group of people who have only been able to do so by being dishonest.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know? And you mentioned going back to Sacred Lives,
Yes,
which
yes.
is a brilliant read, and I will
Thank you.
definitely put a link to that on the
Thank you.
video because it is fantastic. Not only for people with epilepsy, but the general population as such, you know. Um, so tell me a bit more about when you were studying the representation of epilepsy in the arts over time and any particular examples that were striking to you.
I think the art, epilepsy in the cinema was always an area that interested me because, firstly, for two people, there was Sally Baxendale, a psychologist, who's
Yes.
written a lot about it, and a nice lady in America whose name I'm afraid I've just clearly forgotten, who kept a database of all films in which seizures occurred.
Mm.
And you saw seizures being used essentially for dramatic effect in most films.
Hmm.
They weren't used to promote understanding or education. They were used to kind of promote the plot.
Hmm.
And you saw seizures being used, for instance, non-epileptiform seizures being used as deliberately as a distraction for a robbery, for instance.
Right.
Um, you saw seizures being used in a situation where someone was trying to avoid something.
Hmm.
You saw people who had epilepsy in films or had seizures in films were generally not the good person, but the bad person. And
Yes.
this particularly applied to males. Females with epilepsy were often seen as being vulnerable,
Yeah.
and the role they played in the film was that of a vulnerable person. So the whole depiction of epilepsy in the movies is all very unfortunate. And then along came a wonderful film called Electricity,
Yes.
which I think is one of the most moving, realistic films about epilepsy that I have
It
ever
is.
seen. And I really
Yes.
would recommend anyone to go and watch it.
Absolutely. I mean, when that came out, Newcastle University actually asked me to go along and watch it and give a live review.
Mhm.
Uh, and I thought it was fantastic. And for those who don't know what it's about, I'll give a brief synopsis. Basically, the main character is a female character who has epilepsy, but because of her personality and circumstances and background, does not want to conform. She does not want to be put into a box as, oh, this here's an epileptic, let's put her over there, kind of thing. So, like some other people in the real outside world, she tries to kind of live as normal a life as she can, and indeed in places deliberately pushes the boundaries. Um, and in pushing the boundaries, that film highlights some of the stereotypes and myths and cliches, such as photosensitivity, flashing lights, um, but also, I think there's a very brave scene in that film which looks at the interrelationship between epilepsy and sexuality as well. Um, because she has a sexual experience with another female character, and has an epileptic seizure in bed directly after um, that sexual experience. And I thought that was a very brave thing to do, really, because it does highlight how how much of an impact um, epilepsy can have on physical relationships and intimacy. Um, and it was certainly interesting to so a lot of people won't understand or may not have come across the idea before that in that context, the two events can be bi-causal, if you like. Um, so some seizures may manifest as uh, sexual ecstasy, and in turn, some sexual experiences can lead to seizure. Um, and I did recently read a paper where they put the two events of orgasm and seizure together, and they concluded that actually there are a lot of physiological crossovers between those two things. They are physiologically very, very similar events. Uh, and I thought it was quite interesting that electricity actually brought up those issues. Uh,
There's one scene in the film that chimed with me as a neurologist, and that is
yeah,
when she goes to see her neurologist,
yes.
who is portrayed as this very stiff man who seems to have absolutely no empathy whatever. And basically, she's continuing to have seizures.
Hmm.
And he says, first of all, it's your lifestyle and you're not taking the drugs. So here is the transference of blame onto the patient because my
Yes,
treatment that I'm giving you isn't making you better, so you're to blame.
yes.
And the
Hmm.
second thing is that he challenges her on her memory. And he
Hmm.
challenges her, maybe your memory's so bad that you're not remembering to take your drugs.
Hmm.
And she gets up and she walks out of the room.
Hmm.
And that to me is such oh, a little vignette of what your relationship with the person looking after your epilepsy, how important it is that the person is somebody who understands the condition and
Extremely.
empathizes and doesn't force issues. One of the issues that's often forced on people, and I speak from my days as a neurologist, maybe not the case nowadays, but people were forced into changing their drug treatment.
Yes.
Someone would come along and say, "Well, how are you doing?" Well, I've had I'm having one seizure a month, and they're only at night, and that means I can get on the bus and I can go into town.
Hmm.
And the doctor says, "Oh, one seizure a month, that's too many. We're going to change your treatment." And the
Hmm.
person immediately thinks, well, they may change my treatment and they may then have a daytime seizure and can't get the bus
Yeah.
and can't go into town. And so
Yes.
the doctor's not looking holistically
No.
at the issue. He's counting the number of seizures and he's
Yeah.
changing your treatment because he feels you're having too many seizures rather than looking at your lifestyle and all the other aspects of having epilepsy that need to be taken into account.
Yes, and of course that may come from pressure from pharmaceutical companies, as i.e., if you use this drug for so many patients, you'll get a holiday, or you'll get a spa treatment, or you'll get a cash bonus, or whatever.
Yes.
And of course, sadly, that does happen.
It does. I don't know, it's digressing, but I don't know if anyone's ever seen the film Dope Stick, which is about OxyContin being marketed in America. And this was the beginning, if you like, of drug reps, people coming into the doctor's surgery and pushing products. And
Hmm.
all the things you mentioned there, the incentives for prescribing, were really behind the epidemic of OxyContin in the United States.
Yeah.
And Dope Stick is worth watching. It's a very revealing story of how there is a bad side to some of the pharmaceutical industry. Not all. I
No,
mean,
not
it's
all.
not
Not
all,
all.
but and this is really an exception. But it's
Yeah.
a very, very salutary story.
Hmm. Um, and I've lost my own chain of thought
Sorry.
there. It's all right,
Sorry,
but
I've
no, that's
gone
very
off
interesting.
epilepsy.
I remembered. Just shows I am human as well, and that I'm not reading from a script. You on about the side effects. That actually reminded me of something that Sean said just before we went on air. Actually, he said that He said the amount of medication that he takes to combat the side effects of the medication, and that's something that a lot of people don't understand,
They don't. No.
is that there is no magic pill. There's
No.
no medication that comes without side effects. And
Sean,
for some
Sean mentioned
patients,
Sean mentioned the change in his experience from Tegretol, carbamazepine to
yeah.
lamotrigine, and what a big difference that made to him. And I've always reminded somebody came into the clinic many years ago, and they changed from one drug to another.
Mhm.
And I said, did you feel better? And they said, I never realized it before, but for the last few years, I've been looking at life as though I was looking at a window covered in Windowline, a cleaning product. And
Mhm.
as soon as I changed drug treatment, the window became clear and I could see things. And I
Wow.
hadn't seen things clearly for years.
Wow. Amazing. Uh, and yeah, and so one of the interesting things for me, which you might be able to touch upon slightly as a neurologist, is reflex epilepsies.
Mhm, mhm.
Because of course musicogenic seizures are a
Yes,
reflex epilepsy,
yes, yes.
but they're not the only reflex epilepsy.
No.
So, would you be able to give a kind of overview of what reflex epilepsies are?
I'm quite out of date now, but
Yeah.
I'll try.
Yeah.
They are reflexes epilepsies that are triggered by external stimuli, and it can be sound, it can be light, it can be, I suppose, experiences. You could even include in reflex epilepsies some of the epilepsies that can be dietary triggered. They're basically epilepsies that are triggered.
Hmm.
And that's what it comes down to. And that again, I think, opens another area, and that is seizure triggers.
Yes.
And there's a very good book that somebody written. I think it's self-published called Seizure Triggers,
Right.
and it covers all sorts of things that you might not normally think about, particularly in food.
Right.
And the problem with food and diet and E numbers and things like that is it's very
Yes.
difficult to prove scientifically. And
Hmm.
yet, a lot of people have experiences that certain foods can trigger seizures, which they know themselves. They maybe don't repeat to other people, but they learn to modify their diet. And it
Hmm.
may be just an individual thing. It might not apply to all people with epilepsy, but certain food colorings, MSG, things like that, in some people's experience, not in everybody's, may trigger seizures.
Hmm.
And people generally find that, and they find out what things they should avoid.
Hmm. Uh, okay, one of the other things that we've talked about off camera, but I'll bring up. I remember a few years ago, I said to you I was considering compiling a list of the S's relating to epilepsy, called A Room Full of S's, such as seizure, stigma, stereotype, side effects, etc. And you said that one of the biggest ones that is so often left out, and in fact, it was pretty much left out last month as well, is the issue of suicide
Mhm.
in
Yes,
epilepsy.
yes.
And I think I'm 100% behind you in thinking that that is something which shouldn't be swept under the carpet. Um, because when people look at mortality in epilepsy, they immediately think of SUDEP, which is sudden unexpected death through epilepsy, or status epilepticus, which is continuation of seizures. Um, but very, very, very few people actually say the other S word of
Yes.
suicide. And you gave me a statistic, I can't remember what it was, uh,
I
about.
think I think it was the increased rate of suicide in people with complex partial or temporal lobe epilepsy.
Mhm.
And I don't have the figure right at the tip of my tongue, but it was several times greater magnitude than that of the general population.
Mhm.
And I think you're right. I mean, SUDEP and status epilepticus, these are tragedies, absolute tragedies. But in a way, they're tragedies that carry no blame or no stigma.
Yes.
Whereas suicide tragically does carry that. And it
Yes.
carries blame for not just the person, but the person's family, for everybody involved.
Mhm.
And suicide in epilepsy is, if you like, the consequence of the baggage that epilepsy brings into someone's life. It
Yes.
brings in isolation. It brings in the lack of relationships. It brings in the lack of employment. It brings in the lack of self-worth.
Mhm.
And all of these can culminate tragically in somebody taking their life.
Yes.
And the emphasis has always been on SUDEP
Yeah.
and very little emphasis on suicide, sadly.
Mhm. I mean, I totally agree that I mean, more and more people are coming out now, thankfully, and saying it's all right not to be all right.
Yes,
You know?
yes, yes,
Um, and particularly for men, you know, it is perfectly all right not to be all right.
yes, yes,
But the important thing there is if you're not all right, don't say you are.
yes, absolutely,
Uh,
absolutely. And I think we're seeing, sadly, in the United Kingdom now, a reduction in the services provided by organizations like the Samaritans,
yes,
who are now cutting back on their local call centers and
they are.
basically centralizing them. And
Yes,
therefore, there's a loss of touch with people in the local community who knows about the local community. And that's very sad.
it is. Absolutely. And so on a shift away from the subject of mortality and
Mm.
suicide, etc., um, where do you see the trajectory of epilepsy treatment going in the years to come?
Firstly, I think there are many more drugs. When I started off, there were only 4 or 5 drugs that we could use, and 2 of them were phenobarbital and phenytoins. That's an awful long time ago.
Hmm.
Now I think we've got what, 20, nearly 30 different drugs for epilepsy control, and that's great news.
Hmm.
I think we've also got genomic tests now that can look in a proportion of people with epilepsy to find out what the kind of the underlying defect is in their sodium or the glutamate or the channels that cause excitation within the brain. So we're
Hmm.
looking maybe at targeted treatment. So instead of
Yes.
putting everybody on a glutamate antagonist or what have you, you can target people on the basis possibly of genomic testing. So
Hmm.
targeted treatment, I think, is very exciting.
It
I
is.
think the disappointing thing, though, is access. And
Yes.
one of the things that's helped access a great deal has been the development of the epilepsy nurse. And
Yes.
the epilepsy nursing service has been terrific.
Hmm.
But actually getting to see people in any area of the National Health Service is becoming more and more difficult.
It is.
In Glasgow, understand that there is a first seizure clinic, but I understand that the waiting time for a first seizure clinic is many months. And
Wow.
during those many months, people have driving issues, employment issues, all sorts of things that can't wait many months.
Yes.
And what I don't understand is that the annual incidence of epilepsy is about 50 per 100,000 per year. So there are
Right.
about 50 people per 100,000 per year having a seizure. And
Right.
I don't understand why our health system isn't able to assimilate that relatively low number
Hmm.
into a service that sees people quicker than they are seen.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree with you on that one. And so what changes? Well, you've kind of answered two questions in one there, is that you would
Right.
like to see um, that development. And what expansion in support would you like to see for the epilepsy community as a whole?
I'd
Uh,
like to see the community much more involved in supporting peer support, supporting each other. I think one of the things that social media, one of the positive sides of social media, and you mentioned Brain Ablazed
Yes.
early on. I think there are wonderful platforms now where people with epilepsy can come together and discuss issues. And on that website, for instance, people will post, I've just had a seizure, the first one in several months, and people will join in and
Yeah.
support that person. I
Mhm.
think that's wonderful. So I
True.
think social media gives an enormous amount of peer support. Again, to get back to our organizations, our charities, they get most of their funding is statutory funding, and I just feel that people with epilepsy, people who walk the walk, and perhaps not as involved as they ought to be
Yeah.
with their charities and their organizations. It's a
Mhm.
personal view.
Yes. And which is what I was asking you for. So it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today, and I hope it's not too long before I talk to you again in the future. And as I mentioned, I will certainly put a link to Sacred Lives, which is for me very much a must read. And thank you for your time once again, Dr. Ian Bond.
Thank you very much, Guy.